The MSNBC studio fell into stunned silence as Representative Jasmine Crockett slowly removed her earpiece and stared directly into the camera. For 20 minutes, the panel discussion on voting rights legislation had maintained the familiar rhythms of cable news debate, passionate but predictable exchanges between partisan perspectives. Former Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi had confidently defended new state-level voting restrictions as necessary security measures, dismissing concerns about their disproportionate impact on minority communities. "These laws don't target anyone by race," Bondi had declared with practiced certainty. "They simply ensure that only legal votes count." But when host Nicole Wallace turned to Crockett for response, the freshman congresswoman from Texas did something unexpected. Rather than offering the standard Democratic counterpoints, she paused for several seconds, her expression shifting from political poise to personal gravity. "Ms. Bondi," she finally said, her voice carrying a weight that immediately commanded attention. 3 years ago, before you became a regular on television, you gave a speech to the American Enterprise Institute where you stated, and I'm quoting directly, "Let's be honest about what these voting laws are for. When turnout expands in certain communities, we lose. Our job is to adapt our message, not restrict the vote." You then described these exact types of restrictions as, quote, "the lazy solution that undermines democracy rather than winning through better ideas." As Crockett recited Bondi's own words verbatim, the camera caught the former prosecutor's confident expression transform into visible panic, her eyes widening, color draining from her face as she clearly recognized her own damning words being read back to her. When Wallace asked Bondi if she wanted to respond to what appeared to be a complete contradiction of her current position, Bondi's composure entirely collapsed. "That quote it's taken out of... the context was different," she stammered, hands trembling as she shuffled through her notes, desperately searching for some way to reconcile her past candid admission with her current public stance. As Bondi continued to flounder, Crockett calmly held up her phone displaying the video clip of Bondi's speech, saying simply, "I don't want there to be any confusion about context, so I've pulled the actual video. Would you like me to play it so viewers can hear your complete statement?" The moment of absolute panic that flashed across Bondi's face, the realization that her private candor was about to be broadcast alongside her public posturing, created one of the most authentic and unguarded reactions ever captured on political television. Before we dive deeper into this explosive confrontation that has everyone talking, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our in-depth analysis of the most revealing political showdowns that mainstream media often glosses over. Now, let's get back to the moment when Representative Jasmine Crockett methodically exposed the stunning gap between Pam Bondi's private admissions and public posturing on voting restrictions, leaving the normally composed former prosecutor visibly panicking on live national television. Jasmine Crockett's path to that pivotal moment on MSNBC reflected an unconventional trajectory in American politics. Elected to Congress in 2022 after serving just one term in the Texas state legislature, the 41-year-old former civil rights attorney had quickly established herself as one of the most substantive voices in the voting rights debate. Where many of her colleagues approached the issue through partisan framing, Crockett typically grounded her arguments in both constitutional principles and practical impacts on real communities. Her background litigating voting rights cases throughout Texas had given her unusual fluency with the history and implementation of voting restrictions, as well as a strategic approach to public debate that prioritized evidence over rhetoric. Though new to Washington, she approached political combat with the thoroughness and attention to detail that had characterized her legal career, where meticulous research and strategic preparation could determine whether citizens maintained their fundamental right to vote. Pam Bondi, by contrast, had followed a more traditional path to media prominence. Florida's first female attorney general had leveraged her telegenic presence and prosecutorial background into a successful career as a cable news commentator after leaving office in 2019. Throughout her post-government career, she had increasingly tailored her public positions to align with partisan expectations rather than her more nuanced private views. As she built her brand as a reliable voice for conservative talking points, the thoughtful policy perspectives she had occasionally expressed earlier in her career were gradually replaced by more audience-friendly certainties. Television rewards confidence, not complexity. one former colleague observed privately. Pam understood that evolution was necessary for this phase of her career, even if it meant simplifying or adjusting positions she had previously held. The MSNBC segment had been scheduled as a panel discussion on the wave of new voting laws being enacted in various states, with Bondi and Crockett representing opposing perspectives on the legislation. For the first 20 minutes, both guests had presented variations on their party's standard positions, Bondi emphasizing concerns about election security and fraud prevention, Crockett focusing on equal access to the ballot and the absence of evidence for widespread fraud. The tenor of the exchange shifted, however, when host Nicole Wallace pressed Bondi specifically on the disparate impact of certain provisions, such as limits on Sunday, voting that affected traditional souls to the polls events in black churches. These laws don't target anyone by race, Bondi had responded with emphatic certainty. They simply ensure that only legal votes count. Every eligible citizen can still vote. They just need to follow the same rules regardless of race or party. This isn't about suppressing votes. It's about securing elections. It was this categorical denial of any targeted impact or partisan motivation that created the opening for Crockett's devastating countermove. When Wallace turned to her for response, Crockett took the conversation in an unexpected direction. "Ms. Bondi," she said after her momentary pause, 3 years ago, before you became a regular on television, you gave a speech to the American Enterprise Institute where you stated, and I'm quoting directly, "Let's be honest about what these voting laws are for. When turnout expands in certain communities, we lose. Our job is to adapt our message, not restrict the vote." You then described these exact types of restrictions as, quote, "the lazy solution that undermines democracy rather than winning through better ideas." The specificity of the quote, including the venue and time frame, combined with Crockett's measured delivery, created an immediate tension. Unlike typical partisan accusations, this was a direct citation of Bondi's own words directly contradicting her current position. The camera caught Bondi's expression transform from confident authority to visible alarm as she recognized the authenticity of words she had indeed spoken in what she likely assumed was a more private setting. "You went on to say," Crockett continued, her tone remaining conversational rather than accusatory, "that targeting Sunday voting is particularly problematic because we know exactly which communities we're affecting, and it makes a mockery of our claims that these are neutral security measures." The additional quote, directly addressing the specific Sunday voting issue that Bondi had just presented as race-neutral, created another layer of contradiction that visibly intensified Bondi's discomfort. Her hands began making small, nervous adjustments to her papers, as she clearly struggled to process how Crockett had obtained these statements. "Representative Crockett," Wallace interjected, recognizing the significant moment unfolding. "Just to be clear, you're saying Ms. Bondi previously acknowledged these voting restrictions were designed to target specific communities for partisan advantage, despite her current position that they're neutral security measures?" "That's exactly what I'm saying," Crockett nodded. "And it's not my characterization. It's Ms. Bondi's own words from a speech that wasn't intended for public consumption, but was recorded by an attendee. She specifically acknowledged that these restrictions target communities that traditionally vote Democratic, and described them as the lazy solution compared to developing more appealing policies." The methodical way Crockett was building her case, presenting specific quotes with venue and context rather than making general accusations, created a devastating picture that was becoming increasingly difficult for Bondi to dismiss. Wallace turned to the visibly uncomfortable former prosecutor. "Ms. Bondi, would you like to respond to what appears to be a significant contradiction between your private statements and your public position?" It was at this moment that Bondi's typically confident demeanor completely abandoned her. Her expression reflected not just disagreement but genuine panic, the look of someone suddenly confronted with words she never expected to be publicly aired. "That quote it's taken out of... the context was different," she stammered, hands visibly trembling as she shuffled through her notes, clearly searching for some prepared talking point that could address this unanticipated exposure. "I was speaking theoretically about how some might perceive... the full context of my remarks would show... Each attempted explanation trailed off incompletely as she struggled to reconcile her candid private assessment with her contradictory public stance. It was at this point that Crockett delivered her most devastating move, calmly holding up her phone to reveal she had the actual video ready to play. "I don't want there to be any confusion about context," she said with measured calm. "So I've pulled the actual video. Would you like me to play it so viewers can hear your complete statement?" The offer to play the complete video, eliminating any claim about context or misquotation, created a moment of visible panic on Bondi's face that even seasoned political observers found stunning in its rawness. This wasn't the practiced discomfort of a politician caught in a typical contradiction. It was the genuine alarm of someone realizing that carefully maintained public and private personas were about to collide on national television. That's not necessary," Bondi finally managed, her voice barely audible. "What I meant in those remarks was that we should be focusing on both security and accessibility. My position has always been consistent about the importance of election integrity." "With respect, Ms. Bondi," Crockett replied, "your remarks explicitly acknowledge these measures target specific communities for partisan advantage, and called that approach the lazy solution that undermines democracy. That seems fundamentally inconsistent with your current characterization of these same restrictions as neutral security measures that don't target anyone by race. These are your own words, directly contradicting the position you're presenting to viewers today. The direct juxtaposition of Bondi's private candor with her public posturing, coupled with the visible evidence that Crockett possessed the actual video recording, created an extraordinary moment of genuine revelation that transcended typical partisan exchanges. This wasn't one politician accusing another of inconsistency. It was the methodical exposure of a fundamental contradiction between private acknowledgement and public presentation on one of the most consequential issues in American democracy. "Let me just ask directly," Wallace said, recognizing the significance of the exchange. "Do you stand by your statement that these voting restrictions are designed to target communities that typically vote Democratic because when turnout expands in certain communities, we lose?" The directness of the question, coupled with the knowledge that Crockett could immediately disprove any denial with video evidence, created an impossible dilemma for Bondi. Either acknowledge the partisan intent she had previously admitted, contradicting her current public stance, or deny her own recorded words, and risk immediate exposure. Those comments were part of a broader discussion about. Bondi's response dissolved into increasingly incoherent fragments as she visibly struggled to formulate any viable path through the contradiction Crockett had exposed. Recognizing Bondi's complete inability to reconcile her contradictory positions, Wallace turned back to Crockett. "Representative, what do you think this contradiction reveals about the broader debate over these voting laws?" "I think it reveals something many of us have long understood but rarely see acknowledged so explicitly," Crockett responded thoughtfully. "These restrictions aren't about security. They're about determining who participates in our democracy." Ms. Bondi's private candor acknowledged the targeting of specific communities for partisan advantage, while publicly denying any such motivation. That gap between private acknowledgement and public presentation defines much of this debate. She continued with what would prove to be her most impactful observation. "What troubles me most isn't even the partisan motivation. It's the explicit acknowledgement that restricting votes is easier than developing policies that appeal to more Americans. That approach fundamentally undermines the democratic process, as Ms. Bondi herself acknowledged in more candid moments. By framing the issue around democratic principles rather than partisan advantage, Crockett elevated the discussion beyond typical political combat to more fundamental questions about how democracy should function. This approach, combined with the irrefutable evidence of Bondi's own contradictory statements, created a devastating exposure that left the former prosecutor visibly struggling to maintain any semblance of composure. As the segment concluded, the damage had been done. In just under 4 minutes of precise, evidence-based questioning, Representative Crockett had completely transformed what began as a standard panel discussion into a devastating exposure of the gap between private acknowledgement and public posturing on voting rights. Most impressively, she had done so not with partisan attacks or speculation, but by simply presenting Bondi's own words that directly contradicted her current public stance. "What we just witnessed wasn't typical cable news theater," said one political analyst an hour later. "It was the methodical exposure of the fundamental contradiction at the heart of the voting rights debate, the gap between public justifications about security and private acknowledgments about partisan advantage." Representative Crockett didn't need to make accusations or arguments. She simply presented the same person's contradictory statements and allowed the hypocrisy to speak for itself. The result was one of the most authentic moments of panic I've ever seen on political television. By evening, the exchange had become a viral sensation across social media platforms. "Crockett exposes stunning contradiction in voting rights debate" began trending on Twitter, with clips of Bondi's panic-stricken reaction being shared millions of times. Constitutional scholars and voting rights experts from across the political spectrum acknowledged that the exposed contradiction highlighted long-standing questions about the true motivation behind recent voting restrictions. This confrontation revealed what many have long suspected, but rarely seen admitted so explicitly, noted one election law professor. The public justification of security often masks more partisan calculations about which communities' votes are being restricted. Having someone acknowledge this dynamic in private while denying it in public exposes the fundamental dishonesty that has characterized much of this debate. For Pam Bondi, the MSNBC segment marked a potentially career-altering setback to her carefully cultivated media image. She had entered that interview as a respected voice on electoral issues. She left having been methodically exposed for acknowledging in private the very partisan targeting she publicly denied. Her scheduled appearances on other programs over the following days were abruptly canceled as the fallout from the viral exchange continued to spread. In a brief written statement released the following day, Bondi attempted damage control. "My comments at the American Enterprise Institute have been taken out of context and do not reflect my consistent position on the importance of both election security and accessibility. I have always advocated for measures that maintain integrity while ensuring all eligible citizens can vote." The carefully worded statement offered no explanation for the direct contradiction between her private acknowledgement of targeted restrictions and her public denial of any such targeting, nor did it address her characterization of these restrictions as the lazy solution that undermines democracy. For Representative Crockett, the exchange reinforced her rapidly growing reputation as one of the most effective voices in the voting rights debate. What made her approach particularly powerful was that it wasn't based on partisan accusations or theoretical arguments. It was grounded in directly contrasting the same person's private admissions with their public denials, allowing the contradiction to speak for itself. Yesterday's discussion highlighted the importance of honesty in how we talk about voting rights, Crockett said in a brief statement afterward. "When someone privately acknowledges these restrictions, targets specific communities for partisan advantage, while publicly claiming they're neutral security measures, that fundamental dishonesty undermines meaningful debate. We can disagree on policy, but that discussion should be based on acknowledging rather than concealing the real motivations behind these laws." The impact of the exchange extended beyond the immediate viral moment to substantive policy discussions. Several moderate senators who had previously been hesitant about federal voting legislation cited the exposed contradiction as influencing their reconsideration of the issue. Seeing someone privately acknowledge targeting while publicly denying it definitely raised questions about the true motivation behind these state laws, one senator acknowledged privately. "What Representative Crockett exposed goes beyond any single analyst or network," noted one voting rights advocate. She highlighted the fundamental dishonesty that has characterized much of this debate, the gap between private acknowledgments of partisan motivation and public claims about neutral security. That exposure could shift how we discuss these issues going forward. Political analysts noted that the exchange also demonstrated an effective approach to challenging misleading narratives about voting restrictions. What this confrontation showed is the power of direct evidence over theoretical arguments, observed one communications expert. Representative Crockett didn't engage in abstract debates about motivation. She simply presented the same person's contradictory statements and allowed viewers to draw their own conclusions. That approach is far more devastating than any partisan accusation could be. For everyday Americans watching the exchange, it offered a rare, unfiltered glimpse into the gap between public justifications and private acknowledgments that has characterized the voting rights debate. It demonstrated that in an era often dominated by partisan talking points, directly contrasting the same person's private candor with their public posturing could still break through, especially when presented with the strategic precision that Crockett had brought to the exchange. As one democracy advocate observed, what made this moment so powerful wasn't just catching someone in contradiction. It was exposing the fundamental dishonesty at the heart of how we discuss voting rights. The gap between private acknowledgments of partisan targeting and public claims about neutral security. That exposure doesn't just discredit one commentator, it challenges how this entire debate has been framed. 6 months later, the impact of that extraordinary exchange continued to reverberate through political discourse on voting rights. The phrase Bondi Moment had entered the lexicon of political communication, describing instances where private acknowledgments directly contradict public posturing on controversial policies. Journalists increasingly sought out similar contradictions between private admissions and public justifications around voting restrictions, leading to greater scrutiny of the motivations behind these laws. As for Pam Bondi, she had largely retreated from her role as a commentator on voting rights issues, her credibility on the topic severely undermined by the exposed contradiction between her private acknowledgments and public denials. When she eventually resumed limited media appearances, it was with noticeably greater caution and a careful avoidance of definitive claims about the neutrality of voting restrictions. Representative Crockett, meanwhile, had emerged as one of the most influential voices in the voting rights debate, with legal scholars and policy experts across the political spectrum acknowledging the effectiveness of her evidence-based approach to exposing contradictions. She demonstrated that you don't need partisan accusations to challenge misleading narratives, observed one conservative election law expert. You can simply present the same person's contradictory statements and allow viewers to evaluate that contradiction for themselves. That approach advances honest debate regardless of one's policy preferences. The story of how Jasmine Crockett's methodical exposure sent Pam Bondi into a panic serves as a powerful reminder of the impact of evidence-based confrontation in political discourse. It showed that sometimes the most effective response to misleading public narratives isn't partisan counterarguments, but simply presenting someone's private acknowledgments alongside their contradictory public claims, and in so doing, exposing the fundamental dishonesty that undermines meaningful democratic debate. If you found this breakdown of one of the most revealing moments in the voting rights debate informative, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our in-depth analysis of the pivotal moments that expose contradictions in our political discourse. Leave a comment below with your thoughts on Crockett's approach and how exposing private admissions that contradict public claims can advance honest democratic debate.